Well, hello and welcome back to Turning Readers into Writers. And in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the first part in a 3-part series of looking at the writing process. In it, I talk about why it's important to develop a process, and I'll take you through the different steps I go through to going from initial idea to published book. I hope it will prove useful, so let's get started. Welcome to the Turning Readers into Writers podcast, where I teach beginner writers how to find the time and confidence to write their first novel. I'm your host, Emma Desi, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for joining me today, because if you've been longing to write your novel for forever, this is the place to be. Well, hello and welcome to part 1 of this 3-part series on the writing process and why it's important to have one, how I've evolved mine and what it looks like now, with the aim that it will help you. Even if you don't use all of the elements of my process, hopefully there'll be 1 or 2 that you pick up and think, yes, that's worth trying, I'm going to give that a go. So this is the first in the series. I wanted to start with, how I developed the process, because when I knew that I wanted to write more seriously, when I knew that I wanted to finally write that first draft and see where it took me, in order to do that, I needed to have a writing process. So I became quite obsessed with how published authors spent their time. I wanted them to tell me how they spent their day. What time did they get up? When did they have breakfast? Did they have kids? How did they manage that? When did they write? How much did they write? And did they write on pen and paper? Or did they use a laptop? Or did they dictate? I wanted to know it all, because I was sure that if they gave me this, they'd give me the magic formula, the magic potion, some kind of magic foodstuff that I could take that would transform me from being who I was into Kate Atkinson, for example, who, as you might know, is a writer that I love. One of the first things I did was read memoirs, and a very popular memoir is Stephen King's one on writing. I think most writers have read this at some stage. And in it, he told me that if I wanted to be a proper writer, I needed to write for at least 2 hours every day. And I don't mind telling you, the thought of doing that just horrified me. I thought, oh my goodness, there's just no way that I can start writing for 2 hours a day, let alone every day. I couldn't do that once a week, I don't think, at that time, never mind every day. So it really horrified me. And to be honest, it put me off, and it made me think, I don't have this in me, I can't do it. If I can't do it Stephen King's way, then there's no point in even trying, because he's so successful, he's so prolific, he's so respected. I've got to take his advice, I've got to do it his way, or there's just no point. And interestingly, I've come across a number of other writers who've read his book and felt that way afterwards. And it's such a high expectation that it puts people off. And so I've stopped recommending that one to people. Whilst it's an enjoyable read and it's a great insight into his workings, I think that when you're an absolute beginner, being told that if you want to be, in quotes, a proper writer, that you've got to write every day for 2 hours, it's just too much. It's just not feasible in this day and age, especially for those of us that have full-time jobs or full-time caring responsibilities. To fit in 2 hours every day, it's very unfeasible. To be fair to Stephen, though, he was writing this book a long time ago. I think it was, very much pre-email, so life was a lot slower then. And he also had a wife or has a wife, who very kindly put her career on the back burner so that he could progress with his. So I kind of gave up for a while, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is just too much. I don't have this in me. But as for many of us, the writing bug doesn't leave us alone, and it keeps coming back, keeps biting at us. And so I thought, there's got to be another way if I want to be this, in quotes, proper writer. So I went back to other memoirs, I went back to magazines and newspapers, and still hoping that interviewee was going to not just talk about the recent book that they were trying to sell, but their writing process. Ultimately, for me, though, the success kind of came when I started scouring YouTube for my favourite authors, and I discovered Elizabeth Kostova, who talked about her process and how she managed to write while still raising 3 young children. I've talked about it before, but she was the person who said, I had 3 kids, I was busy, I could only write what I could when I could. And that was the light bulb moment for me. I realised I had to write what I could when I could. There was no other way around it. I had to sit down at my desk with my pen and paper and start writing. There was no magic formula, much to my disappointment. So I have evolved this process, but one thing I want to sort of stress to you is that there is no one size fits all. You will begin to evolve your own process. It might be that you find you cannot work in the daytime like I do. You prefer to work in the evening, or it's the only time in the day that you have, so you have to fit in around that. But I want you to have a listen. The episodes are going to be really small, so it's not too much to digest in any one go, but they may well be useful to you. You'll get an insight into the way that I write, just as I took insight from people like Elizabeth Kostova, and then you can take from it what you need. There might be nothing that suits you, but equally, there might just be one step in the process that you think is worth trying. So it's not prescriptive. It is a process that has evolved, so your writing process will evolve as well. It takes a bit of time to develop because you are discovering this new side of yourself. It's your writer side. It's not your wife side or your mother side or your employee or spouse side of your life. This is a whole new fascinating facet to yourself, and it might take you a little bit of time to get to know this side of yourself and find the best way of working for you. But I'm sure you will. You'll figure it out and have fun along the way, of course. We've got to remember that in amongst all this hard work, it's supposed to be fun too. So the first stage for me, and really I think this is the first stage for most people, it's before you even put pen to paper. And I've written about it in the past actually, but it's what I like to call mulling it over. So I've got an idea in my head. I think this might be a good story idea, so I need to give it some thought about who the character might be, the main character, where it might be taking place, and what kind of journey that character might go on. It might come to nothing. There's always that possibility that the story kind of dies a bit of a death. It's not necessarily because the story's not a good one, but it may be that I'm not the right person to tell it. And in the accompanying blog post, I do make reference to Elizabeth Gilbert's theory of these spirits of creativity that fly around the world and kind of attach themselves to people, and it's up to that writer to decide whether they're going to take the story on and give it the attention that it needs. So it's not that I necessarily agree with this or believe in these kind of spirits, but I do think there is an element of truth to it, that there is kind of this kinetic energy that goes around the world, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if there's some kind of wave where we transmit our thoughts around the world and we pick up some and we let go of others. So it might just be that this wave, the story wave, doesn't resonate with me, or I'm not the right person to tell it, and so off goes that story wave to somebody else who can tell it better. But eventually one is going to land with me. I'm going to mull that story over, have an idea of where it's going to go, it'll stick, and so then I can extrapolate this kind of skeleton storyline. Now if you're a plotter, if you love to have a plot for your stories, this is the time to really start brainstorming. Some people just want to do a list of bullet points. Others really like to use a mind map, and from there put the book in order, put the plot in some kind of order and start filling it out. I am a discovery writer, so for those of you like me, I kind of don't really go past the mulling it over stage. I just have a basic idea in my head where it may end up, what my halfway point might be. And usually I've got an opening scene in my brain, and that's sort of where I start. So step 2 is to write it. So as I say, I don't plot anything, I just get down to writing. And for me, I handwrite rather than use a computer, which I know some people find a bit strange because it can kind of double the workload essentially. But for me, this process really works because it slows my brain down just enough that my hand can keep up with it. And by the time my hand has written what I've been thinking, the next line comes to mind. And I know that, don't ask me the science of it, I couldn't give you that, but it has been shown that when you write by hand, it helps to facilitate the composition of thoughts and the formulation of ideas. So I think definitely that works for me. It does take a toll on me physically, and if you write regularly, I wonder if you have been experiencing some kind of physical symptoms of the writing, whether it be hand cramps or shoulder tightening, that kind of thing. So I do get a lot of shoulder cramp and a lot of headaches as a result, so I have to be very careful about how I sit when I'm writing. But I stick with this system of handwriting initially because it just makes me happy. Makes me happy to see the notepads get fat as I continue writing. I don't know why, but the paper kind of gets fat when you've written on both sides, and I love seeing the notepads get bigger. It makes me feel proud of what I've written to date, and I can see I am being consistent here. I love that feeling of, look at the work I've done, keep going. It encourages me, it makes me want to turn up at my desk the next day and make that notebook even fatter. So I go to the cafe, and after I've dropped the kids off at school, I go to the cafe and I sit and I write for roughly 2.5 hours, depending on what's happening that day and my mood, and if the words are coming easier or not. And for me, the writing goal of each session is to write a chapter. I've mentioned this briefly before, that my chapters are kind of around the same size, sort of between 2,000 and 2,500 words per chapter. But this does vary, of course, depending on where I am in the book, what's happening in that chapter, and where in the book we are. So, if there's any pacing considerations I need to make, can I afford to have a longer chapter that day? Am I moving towards the end of the book where I need to shorten my chapters just to increase that feeling of anticipation and that building towards the climax? Now, I know some people might find this a little bit formulaic, but that's absolutely fine because, as I say, there's no one size fits all. Everybody writes in their own way. But I like this process because it sort of keeps me on track. It's a nice guide for me. Just like having the notebook getting fatter and fatter, then getting the chapters written one by one gives me that feeling of momentum, feeling of completion, that feeling of progression, and that in turn feeds into my motivation and my confidence, and it helps me to keep going. The other thing to remember, of course, is that this is the first draft, or what's called the rough draft. So I know that whatever I put down in those notepads, they're not necessarily going to stay there. They're certainly going to be improved upon. They may even be taken out altogether. But for me, just having that first draft down is the most important thing. I'm not a perfectionist in any way. I want to get the story down so that I can go back and work on it. I think it was Anne Lamott. She likes to say that you have a down draft and an up draft. The down draft is when you just get the words down, and then your up draft is when you fancy it all up and put in the nice words and the beautiful sentences. So that takes me, let's think, if I'm on a good run, I can write my first draft, say, within 3 months. That's fairly speedy, but then there's a lot of work that gets done on the other end once the story is down. Once the story is written, then I move on to step 3, which is the transcribing. But I'm going to cover that in next week's article. I'm going to leave us there for today, just for you to have a think about why it's important to have a process, who you might turn to look for building a process, what have you read elsewhere that might be useful to you, even if it's just to take 1 or 2 elements from who you're listening to or reading from. Take those elements, try them out. I've told you that the first step for me is to do the mulling it over. Really, really important. Give that story idea some thought. Has it got legs? Are you going to run with it? Is it going to keep you interested for the next possibly 12 months as you work on it? And then step 2 is to get the story down. My advice is always get the words down, fancy it up later. You can work on what you have. As the old saying goes, you can't improve a blank page. So try not to procrastinate too much. Try not to overthink your words. Just get that story down and you can make it nice later. All right, so next week we will talk about the transcription and step 3. Take care for now. Bye-bye. Have you been wanting to start writing your first novel but have been feeling uncertain about how to get started? Well, I have a simple resource for you called The 3 Easy Steps to Start Writing Your Novel. This simple cheat sheet will help you begin your writing journey by resolving that perennial problem of how to find the time to actually write. The answer is super simple and super actionable. And if you wanted to, you can get started today. So go to emmadesi.com/3 easy steps and start writing today.